So I want you to picture this. It's December 1776. The American Revolution is basically teetering on the edge of just total collapse.
Right. Things are not looking good.
Exactly. And George Washington is standing on the banks of the icy Delaware River. He's preparing for this desperate, make-or-break surprise attack. And, we all know the painting, right?
Oh, yeah. The classic one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's standing tall and stoic in the wooden boat, gazing nobly off into the middle distance. He's wrapped in that majestic cloak, bathed in this divine, glowing light. It's like the ultimate image of a marble-carved demigod leading a righteous cause.
It really is. I mean, it's the defining image of American mythology.
Right. But what actually happened on that riverbank, well, according to the journals of the men who were, actually there, it was freezing, it was miserable, and everyone was terrified.
They were starving, too.
Yeah, starving and barefoot. So, as Washington was rallying his troops, he stepped into the boat. And standing in his way was his chief of artillery, General Henry Knox. Now, Knox was a brilliant man, but he also weighed roughly 280 pounds.
A big guy.
A very big guy. So Washington doesn't offer some noble prayer. Instead, he just nudges Knox with the tip of his boot and says, "Shift that fat ass, Harry. But slowly, or you'll swamp the damn boat."
Which is just, I mean, it's such a brilliant, humanizing moment. And that quote was actually reported by Knox himself years later.
Wait, really? Knox is the one who told that story.
Yeah. And what's fascinating here is how much more revealing that raw truth is than the painting, Washington wasn't a statue. He was a plain-spoken frontiersman, a real person in a highly stressful, freezing situation.
Just making a crude, tension-breaking joke to a trusted colleague.
Exactly. It completely changes how you see the man.
It really does. And honestly, that is exactly what we are doing today. So welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is to thoroughly unpack Kenneth C. Davis's revised edition of the classic book, Don't Know Much About History.
Which is such a fantastic resource.
It is. And you, our listener, have provided us with this massive stack of excerpts from the book. We're covering everything from the absolute myth of Christopher Columbus to the deeply agonizing contradictions of the Founding Fathers.
All the way up to the messy realities of the 2000 election and the aftermath of 9/11.
Yeah, exactly. And our goal for this deep dive is to kind of shortcut your path to being incredibly well-informed. We are going to strip away what this text so perfectly calls the historical tummy tucks of high school textbooks.
The tummy tucks. I just love that phrase.
It is so good. It's like the educational system applied an Instagram filter to the past. They smoothed over all the blemishes, hid the ugly scars, and made sure everyone had a perfect glowing complexion.
Right. But in doing so, they completely removed the humanity.
Precisely.
Right.
So the core premise we're exploring today is that Americans don't actually hate history. What you probably hated was the dull, sanitized, Hollywood costume drama version you were forced to memorize.
Yeah. If you think back to your own history classes, were you forced to memorize a disconnected list of dates by some high school football coach who just got drafted to teach history to fill out his schedule?
Oh my gosh, I definitely had that exact teacher, Coach Johnson. He'd just be like, "Memorize the date of the Magna Carta, kids. They were watching a movie."
Exactly. We all had a Coach Johnson. But real history isn't a list of dates. It's a study of causality. It's about the profound consequences of human actions and the constant, messy, often violent struggle for power.
Like money, church, land, votes, all of that.
Exactly. Whether that power takes the form of money or control of the church, it is an eternal tug of war between the haves and the have-nots.
But, if seeing the flaws makes these historical figures more human, more relatable, and honestly more impressive because they overcame actual human weaknesses, why did the educational system insist on the marble demigod version for so long?
That's a really crucial question.
Like, why give history a tummy tuck in the first place?
Well, traditionally, institutions, so governments, school boards, religious organizations, they want their founding heroes to be pure and unsullied because it builds a cohesive national mythology.
Ah, so it's a unifying thing.
Right. It's about instilling patriotism and a sense of shared, unquestionable identity. The logic is, if your founders are flawless, then the nation they founded must be fundamentally righteous.
Oh. But the danger there, as we're seeing, is that it completely disconnects us from the reality of cause and effect. If you don't understand that flawed humans made decisions based on raw power and economics, You literally cannot connect the dots to our present day.
Yeah, you're basically walking around blind to how the world actually works.
Exactly.
And that is the exact mechanism of history we need to understand. Let's look at how connecting those dots actually works in practice. The text brings up the 1919 Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I.
Right, which in a textbook is literally just a date to memorize. 1919. The war ended. Move on.
Exactly. A bunch of guys in top hats signed a piece of paper in a mirrored hallway in France. But look at the mechanics of what happened in that room. The victorious European powers, primarily Britain and France, sat down with maps and simply carved up the fallen Ottoman Empire and the Middle East.
Just drew lines on a map.
Literally. They carved them into mandates and colonies. They drew arbitrary lines right through the middle of ancient ethnic, religious, and tribal territories. They didn't care about the people living there. They cared about controlling the oil and the trade routes.
So they basically created Frankenstein countries.
That's exactly what they did. They forced rival groups into single national borders or split unified groups across multiple new nations. And the text points out that you can draw a direct, unbroken line of causality from those arbitrary lines drawn in 1919 straight to the modern geopolitical instability in the Middle East.
Wow, and the Balkans too, right?
Yes, the brutal conflicts in the Balkans, and even the roots of the Vietnam War. Because a young Ho Chi Minh was actually at Versailles pleading for Vietnamese independence from France, and he was completely ignored.
Man, it's like the butterfly effect, but with empires.
Exactly. Or consider a more modern example from the text, the CIA's overthrow of the Iranian government in 1953.
Okay, yes, break down the mechanics of this one for me, because I feel like this is a huge blind spot for a lot of us.
Right. So in the early 1950s, Iran had a democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh, and he decided to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which had previously been controlled by the British.
Okay, so he wants Iran's oil for Iran.
Precisely. The British were furious, and they convinced the American CIA that Mossadegh was leaning towards Soviet communism, which, was the ultimate trigger word during the Cold War.
Right, so the U.S. gets involved to protect the oil and stop communism.
Yes. The CIA, in an operation called Ajax, engineers a coup. They paid off street gangs, bribed military officers, and essentially overthrew this elected leader. They replaced him by restoring the Shah of Iran to absolute power.
Wow.
And for the CIA and British oil companies, it looked like a brilliant short-term victory. The oil flowed, and the Shah was fiercely anti-Soviet.
But history doesn't stop just because you won the news cycle that week.
Exactly. The Shah ruled with an iron fist for the next 25 years, using a brutal secret police force. And that prolonged U.S.-backed oppression created deep, simmering resentment among the Iranian populace.
Which eventually boils over.
Right. It directly fueled the 1979 Islamic Revolution. So the short-term tummy tuck of "we stopped communism" completely hides the long-term reality of we inadvertently engineered our own future geopolitical nightmare.
Yeah, and the text doesn't shy away from domestic examples of this either. It dives into COINTELPRO, the FBI program run by J. Edgar Hoover.
Right. COINTELPRO, which stands for Counterintelligence Program. It started in the 1950s, aimed at the Communist Party, but it rapidly expanded.
And the mechanics of it are genuinely terrifying. I mean, the FBI wasn't just investigating crimes, they were actively infiltrating, wiretapping, and disrupting domestic civil rights and anti-war groups.
They were trying to destroy reputations.
Yeah, they were trying to ruin the lives of American citizens who were just exercising their First Amendment rights.
And we really must emphasize here that the text presents this not as a partisan attack, but as a documented historical fact. It's a stock lesson in how government intelligence agencies, often operating under the guise of national security, can systemically trample constitutional rights.
Which brings to mind that quote from George Kennan. He was the architect of America's Cold War containment policy, the guy who literally wrote the playbook on how to handle the Soviet Union.
Yes. Kennan brilliantly warned that the worst thing we could fear from our enemies is that we might eventually become like them.
Right, that in our zeal to fight totalitarianism, we might adopt totalitarian methods ourselves.
Exactly. That is the ultimate danger of the tummy tuck. If you sanitize the past, if you pretend the FBI never crossed the line, or that the CIA never overthrew a democracy, you literally cannot learn the lessons necessary to prevent it from happening again.
And this habit of sanitizing our history doesn't just apply to the Founding Fathers or the Cold War. It starts at the very beginning, like the literal first chapter of the American story, the so-called discovery.
Oh, the discovery illusion. This is where the filter is applied, the absolute heaviest. The myth, we are all taught, is that America was this vast, pristine, empty wilderness, just patiently waiting in silence for Europeans to show up and discover it.
It is an incredibly Eurocentric view of the world.
Completely. The reality is that the Americas were teeming with life, complex civilizations, trade networks, and diverse cultures. The revised estimates discussed in the text suggest that up to 100 million indigenous people were living across the Americas prior to European arrival.
100 million. I mean, to put that in perspective for you listening, that is roughly the population of the entire continent of Europe at the exact same time.
It's staggering.
It's like thinking your house was built the exact day you moved in, completely ignoring the massive extended family who lived there, built additions, cooked in the kitchen, and painted the walls for hundreds of generations.
That is a perfect analogy. You are stepping into an incredibly ancient, lived-in space, and the scientific puzzle of how those first Americans actually got here is constantly evolving.
Let's break down the mechanics of that, because the textbook version I learned was very simple. The Bering Land Bridge. Case closed. We all walked over the ice.
Right. The Bering Land Bridge theory is the classic model. During the last ice age, sea levels dropped dramatically because so much of the Earth's water was locked up in massive glaciers.
Which exposed a lot of land.
Exactly. It exposed a strip of land roughly 1,000 miles wide, connecting modern-day Siberia to Alaska. The theory posits that around 11,500 years ago, nomadic hunters followed herds of megafauna, like woolly mammoths, across this bridge.
And the proof for this was always the Clovis points, right?
Exactly. Archaeologists found these beautifully crafted, fluted stone spearheads in Clovis, New Mexico, dating back roughly 11,000 years. And for decades, the Clovis first theory was gospel. These were the first Americans. End of story.
But the text says that neat linear timeline is being totally demolished by new discoveries because they started finding things that didn't fit the Clovis timeline at all.
This is where the science gets really thrilling. Enter the Pacific Coastal Route theory. Archaeologists began unearthing sites like Monte Verde in southern Chile.
Chile, that's really far south.
Very far south. Deep in a peat bog which perfectly preserves organic material, they found remnants of wooden tent stakes, chewed medicinal seaweed, and even a child's footprint.
And the kicker is the date, right?
Yes. The radiocarbon dating placed the Monte Verde site at least 12,500 years old. That is a full millennium before the Clovis points, and crucially, thousands of miles further south.
Wow.
If the ice-free corridor in North America hadn't opened up yet, how did they get all the way down to Chile?
They didn't walk, they sailed.
Precisely. The coastal route theory suggests that early humans used boats to navigate along the kelp highway of the Pacific coast, leapfrogging from ice-free refuges down the coastline of the Americas long before the inland glaciers melted enough to walk through.
That is so cool. And then there's the Kennewick Man. This is the part of the text that absolutely scrambled my brain. How does one skeleton found in a river in Washington state change our entire understanding of human migration?
The Kennewick Man is a fascinating and, highly controversial discovery. He was discovered in 1996 along the Columbia River, and the skeleton was radiocarbon dated to between 8,000 and 9,300 years old.
Okay, so very old.
Yes, but what stunned anthropologists was his cranial morphology, basically the shape of his skull.
Because it didn't look like modern Native American skull.
Correct. Initial assessment suggested his physical characteristics more closely resembled the Ainu people of Japan or Polynesian groups, rather than the Siberian ancestors of most modern Native Americans.
Wow.
Now, later DNA analysis did eventually link him more closely to modern indigenous groups, but the initial confusion opened up a Pandora's box of complex migration theories.
It forced scientists to ask, wait, what if it wasn't just one group walking across a bridge? What if it was multiple waves of people from different places using different routes over tens of thousands of years?
Exactly. And the text mentions the North Atlantic route theory, where ancient Europeans might have followed the edge of the ice pack across the Atlantic. They point to artifacts found in Pennsylvania and Virginia dating back 10,000 to 16,000 years.
And didn't it mention Thor Heyerdahl, too?
Yes. There's even mention of Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki theory, suggesting possible contact between South America and Polynesia.
The overarching point here is that America wasn't an empty waiting room. It was a thriving, deeply complex mosaic of civilizations. But the text is also careful not to give the pre-Columbian Americas a tummy tuck either. We shouldn't romanticize these societies as perfect, peaceful utopias.
No, absolutely not, because they were human societies. which means they were incredibly complex and often brutal. They were highly advanced in many ways. They practiced sophisticated agriculture like the Aztec chinampas, those floating gardens that yielded massive crop outputs.
Right, and they understood complex mathematics and astronomy.
Exactly, but they largely lacked written languages outside of Mesoamerica, and their political systems were often built on conquest.
Yeah, the text is very explicit about the brutality. It details the Aztec practice of human sacrifice, which was driven by this cosmological belief that the sun literally needed human blood to keep moving across the sky.
It was a very grim worldview.
Very. At their peak, they were sacrificing up to 1,000 captured enemies a day near present-day Mexico City.
And in North America, the text mentions the Iroquois, who were politically sophisticated enough to form a democratic confederacy, but who also practiced mourning wars.
What were those?
Well, captured opponents were subjected to ritualistic, sophisticated torture as a way to replace dead members of their own tribe. It was brutal.
So if we establish that tens of millions of people with complex, warring, advanced civilizations were already here for tens of thousands of years, the next logical question is, who were the first Europeans to actually bump into them?
Well, we know definitively who it wasn't.
It wasn't Christopher Columbus. The text calls him a total Johnny-come-lately.
He really is. Columbus is incredibly late to the party. The best-supported archaeological evidence, corroborated by historical documents, points directly to the Norsemen, led by Leif Erikson.
The Vikings.
Exactly. They established a physical colony in present-day Newfoundland, Canada, around AD 1000.
That is almost exactly 500 years before Columbus set sail. Half a millennium. And we know this because of two things, right? The Vinland sagas and physical proof.
Yes, the Vinland sagas were oral histories passed down by the Norse and eventually written down. For a long time, historians just thought they were myths.
Right, just tall tales.
But then, in the 1960s, archaeologists uncovered the site at Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland. They found the unmistakable foundations of Norse longhouses and, crucially, evidence of iron smelting.
Which is a technology the indigenous peoples of that region did not possess.
Exactly. And the details in the text about how these Norsemen survived are wild. We think of exploration as this grand romantic adventure, but the mechanics of a Viking sea voyage were just brutal.
Yeah, they survived on the open ocean by eating dried cod, right?
And not the kind of dried fish you buy in a modern grocery store. The Norse would catch cod and hang it in the freezing winter air until it lost roughly 4/5 of its weight. The wind and the cold cured it until it became a durable, literal wood-like plank.
You could probably build a shelf out of it.
You really could. And when they were hungry on the ships, they would just break off a piece of this fish wood and chew on it for hours to extract the protein. It was this massive caloric engine that fueled their expansion.
That sounds exhausting just to eat. But their stay in North America didn't last long, primarily because their interactions with the indigenous peoples, whom the Norse contemptuously referred to in the sagas as Skrendlings, or wretched ones, were immediately hostile.
Right. The Norse were vastly outnumbered, and their iron weapons weren't enough of an advantage against the sheer numbers of the local population.
There is this one incredible detail from the sagas mentioned in the text. The Norse colony was under attack, and the men were retreating. But a pregnant Norse woman named Freydis Eiríksdóttir rushed at her dwelling.
Oh, this story is wild.
It is. She picks up a fallen sword, and to terrify the advancing indigenous warriors, she rips open her bodice and slaps the flat of the cold iron sword against her bare breast while screaming a war cry.
It is such a visceral, terrifying image, and apparently it worked. The sheer shock of this behavior caused the attackers to retreat, but the overall hostility eventually forced the Norse to abandon the continent.
So the Norse are the verified winners of the first European title. But beyond them, the text explores this incredible shadow history of myths and unverified arrivals.
Oh, there are dozens of theories. There is the legend of St. Brendan, an Irish monk who supposedly sailed to North America in the 6th century in a curragh, which is a boat made of stretched leather.
Which sounds completely insane until you realize a British explorer actually built a leather curragh in the 1970s and successfully sailed it across the Atlantic just to prove it was physically possible.
Exactly. Then there's the legend of the Welsh Prince Modoc in the 12th century, and the fascinating, though widely disputed theory of the Chinese admiral Zheng He, who commanded a massive fleet of treasure ships in the early 1400s.
Right. Some theorize his fleet mapped the coast of the Americas 70 years before Columbus.
Yes, though again, heavily disputed.
But the text argues that while those are largely unverified, The truly verified, consistent European visitors before Columbus were the fishermen. And this is my absolute favorite part of the whole book.
Ah, the Basque and English fishermen.
Yes. We know officially that John Cabot sailed for the British in 1496 and reported waters off Newfoundland so thick with cod you could catch them in baskets. And Verrazano sailed for the French in 1524.
But the real story is earlier.
Exactly. The text reveals that anonymous Basque fishermen from Spain and English fishermen from Bristol were secretly fishing for cod off the coast of North America long before 1492.
And the mechanics of the European economy at the time explain exactly why. Catholic Europe required fish for meatless Fridays and Lent. Salted cod was a massive, highly lucrative commodity, and the Basque were the absolute masters of catching and salting cod.
But they kept their fishing grounds a total secret. It is the ultimate secret fishing hole analogy.
It really is.
If you are an angler and you find a spot where the fish are practically jumping into your boat, you don't go back to the docks and draw a map for everyone else. You keep your mouth shut.
Exactly. They were crossing the Atlantic, setting up temporary camps on the Canadian coast to dry and salt the fish, and then returning to Europe to sell them at a premium. It's entirely possible that the discovery of a massive new continent was essentially suppressed for decades just to protect a really good fishing spot.
That's hilarious. And importantly, they didn't care about the land. They probably just thought it was some random island off the coast of Asia. They were there for the cod, not for conquest.
Which brings us, inevitably, to the man who was there for conquest. If all these people beat him to the continent, we have to unpack the massive, catastrophic chain reaction that occurred when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492.
Because the reality of 1492 has absolutely nothing to do with proving the Earth was round. That is the first massive tummy tuck we need to undo.
It is a deeply persistent myth. But the educated world in 1492, and frankly, any sailor who had ever watched a ship disappear hull first over the horizon, knew the Earth was a sphere.
Right, the ancient Greeks calculated its circumference thousands of years earlier.
Yes. The text even points out that there was literally a spherical globe constructed in Nuremberg, Germany, the very same year Columbus set sail.
So if he wasn't trying to prove the Earth was round, what was the actual mechanical driver of his voyage?
It was pure, unadulterated economics, driven by a geopolitical crisis. For centuries, Europe had relied on the Silk Road and overland routes to access the massive wealth of Asia, what Marco Polo called Cathay.
We're talking spices, silks, gold, perfumes.
Exactly. And the text has a great term for the people buying this stuff. The yuppies, the young European princes. They had a ravenous appetite for luxury goods.
But in 1453, the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople, effectively cutting off or heavily taxing all overland trade from Asia to Christian Europe. The prices for spices just skyrocketed.
And spice wasn't just a luxury. It was essential for preserving meat and masking the taste of food that was starting to rot.
Right. So Europe is desperate for a workaround. The Portuguese start trying to sail all the way south around the tip of Africa. But Columbus has a different pitch. He says, if the world is round, let's just sail west to get to the east.
Which is logically sound, but Columbus's entire pitch was based on a massive, catastrophic mathematical error.
Let's get into the mechanics of this error, because it is essentially the luckiest blooper in human history.
It really is. Columbus based his calculations on the writings of a 9th century Persian astronomer named Alfraganus. Alfraganus calculated the circumference of the Earth quite accurately using Arabic miles.
Okay.
But Columbus, either through ignorance or willful deception, assumed Alfraganus was using Roman miles, which are significantly shorter.
So he artificially shrinks the globe on paper.
Drastically. He also overestimated the size of the Eurasian landmass, stretching it further east. When he did his cooked-up math, he estimated that Japan was only about 2,400 miles west of the Canary Islands.
But the reality, the actual physical distance, is 10,600 miles. He was off by 8,000 miles.
It's a huge miscalculation.
It's like a modern tech startup lying on its prospectus to get venture capital funding. Oh yeah, profitability's right around the corner. Just give us the money.
The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, had their own royal advisors who checked Columbus's math and told the king and queen, he's wrong. The ocean is way too vast. They will all starve to death before they reach Asia.
But Ferdinand and Isabella had just finished driving the Moors out of Spain. They were feeling triumphant, they had a little extra cash, and they took a venture capital gamble.
And it was only pure luck that a massive, unknown double continent happened to be sitting right in his path at the 3,000-mile mark. If the Americas hadn't been there, Columbus and his crew would have died of thirst and starvation in the middle of a boundless Pacific Ocean.
And you can see the desperation in the crew as the voyage dragged on. They were threatening mutiny. Columbus had to keep 2 separate logbooks, a fake one showing shorter distances to calm the crew, and a real one for himself.
Right. But finally, on October 12, 1492, they spot land. And even in this triumphant moment, Columbus proves his true character.
Oh, the story of Rodrigo de Triana. This is so indicative of who Columbus was. So Columbus had promised a massive lifetime pension, 10,000 maravedis, to the first man who physically spotted land.
And at 2 a.m., a lookout named Rodrigo de Triana, peering into the moonlight from the Pinta, spots the white sands of the Bahamas and shouts, "Tierra, tierra!"
But when it comes time to collect the reward, Columbus claims that he actually saw a flickering light the night before, but just didn't mention it to anyone. He steals the pension from his own lookout.
It's unbelievable.
What an absolute boss move in the worst possible way.
And that ruthlessness immediately translates to how he treats the indigenous Arawak people he encounters. The text quotes Columbus's own diary. Upon meeting them, he doesn't note their culture or humanity.
What does he write?
He writes, "They do not bear arms. With 50 men, all can be kept in subjection and made to do whatever you desire."
That is bone-chilling. That is the literal mission statement for genocide.
Because remember, he promised the Spanish monarchs gold. But there wasn't massive surface gold in the Caribbean, so he instituted the encomienda system, which was essentially legalized slavery.
Unpack the mechanics of this quota system, because it's vital to understanding the horrific reality of the conquest.
Columbus demanded that every indigenous person 14 years and older had to collect a certain quota of gold dust every 3 months. If they met the quota, they were given a copper token to wear around their necks.
And if they didn't have the token?
If they were found without a token, the Spanish would cut off their hands and let them bleed to death. If they tried to flee into the mountains, they were hunted down with attack dogs.
Oh my God.
If they mounted any resistance, the Spanish enacted horrific reprisals. The text notes they would hang them in rows of 13 in reverence, they claimed, to Jesus and his 12 disciples.
That is just sick. So within a matter of decades, the massive Arawak population was virtually exterminated, primarily through European diseases like smallpox, but also through brutal overwork, suicide, and outright murder.
Which brings up another fascinating historical myth that the text completely dismantles: the idea of the Columbian exchange regarding syphilis.
Yes. The urban legend I was always taught is that the Europeans brought smallpox to the Americas, and as a kind of biological revenge, the indigenous people gave the sailors syphilis, which they took back and spread throughout Europe.
It makes for a neat, balanced narrative, but the archaeological evidence now completely challenges it.
Really?
Yes. The text points out that researchers have unearthed pre-Columbian skeletons in England, dating from a monastery hundreds of years before Columbus sailed, that show the distinct, unmistakable bone lesions caused by treponemal diseases, which includes syphilis.
So the bacteria was already in Europe.
Exactly. It likely mutated into a more virulent, sexually transmitted form right around the late 15th century, purely by coincidence.
And the name syphilis itself proves how desperate Europeans were to blame anyone else for it. Where did the name actually come from?
It didn't come from the Americas. It was coined in 1530 by an Italian physician and poet named Girolamo Fracastoro. He wrote a poem about a shepherd boy named Syphilis, who angered the Greek god Apollo and was cursed with the disease as punishment.
But at the time, no one actually called it syphilis, right?
No, they just blamed their political rivals. The Italians called it the French disease. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. The Spanish blamed the Jews. No one wanted to take credit for the outbreak.
And speaking of not getting credit, the ultimate irony of Columbus's life is that he never realized what he had found, and he didn't even get to put his name on the continent.
This is the final cruel trick of history. Columbus goes to his grave absolutely insisting he had reached the outskirts of Asia. He was in total denial. Enter Amerigo Vespucci.
Right, Vespucci was an Italian ship chandler, basically a guy who supplied ships, who helped outfit some of Columbus's later voyages. But a few years later, Vespucci actually sailed down the coast to South America himself.
And Vespucci realizes what Columbus couldn't. The math. He looks at the massive coastline of Brazil and realizes this isn't an island off Japan. This is a massive, unbroken landmass.
Right. Vespucci, or someone writing under his name, publishes a series of letters about his voyages. And crucially, he uses a brilliant PR phrase. He calls it the Mundus Novus. the New World.
It's purely a branding victory.
It really is. Because his letters were highly entertaining and widely read in Europe, a German mapmaker named Martin Waldseemüller read them. And when he was drawing the new map of the world in 1507, he decided to honor Vespucci.
He took the Latinized version of his name, Americus, made it feminine to match Europa and Asia, and slapped the word America right across the southern continent.
By the time the mapmaker realized Columbus had technically been there first, it was too late. The name had stuck. Millions of copies of the map were circulating. The printing press locked in the branding.
So this pattern of exploitation, conquest, and economic extraction for profit, which began with Columbus and the Spanish conquistadors, became the absolute blueprint. The English watched the Spanish getting rich on silver and gold and decided they wanted a piece of the action.
Right. They set up colonies in North America purely to extract raw materials for the mother country.
Which brings us to the road to the American Revolution. And again, the text strips away the tummy tuck. The build-up to the revolution wasn't just a spontaneous explosion of noble philosophical ideals about liberty.
It is much more complicated.
It was a slow burn, deeply rooted in shifts in religious psychology, brilliant media public relations, and cold, hard economics.
Let's start with the religious psychology, because this is something textbooks rarely connect to the revolution. The Great Awakening in the 1740s.
The Great Awakening was a massive wave of religious revivalism that swept through the colonies. Prior to this, religion in the colonies, like Puritanism or the Anglican Church, was highly structured, hierarchical, and frankly, a bit dull.
You sat in your pew, listened to a highly educated minister, read a dense theological sermon, and deferred to authority.
But the text says the Great Awakening completely shattered that dynamic. It was led by these incredibly charismatic, itinerant evangelists. The text mentions guys like George Whitefield, who would put modern megachurch televangelists to shame.
Whitefield would preach in open fields to crowds of thousands, right? He was theatrical, he wept, he roared.
Yes, and the core message of the Great Awakening was profoundly democratic. You don't need a bishop, a priest, or an elite education to communicate with God. Salvation is deeply personal and emotional.
So how does a religious revival mechanically lead to a political revolution 30 years later?
It broke the habit of deference to authority. If you can challenge the established religious hierarchy and decide that you, a common farmer, have a direct line to the Creator, it's not a huge leap to eventually challenge the political hierarchy of a king across an ocean.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Furthermore, these preachers traveled across colonial borders. It created the first shared intercolonial cultural experience. Before this, you were a Virginian or a Pennsylvanian. The Great Awakening started to unify them culturally.
And while the culture was unifying, the mechanics of media and public relations were also shifting. The text highlights the trial of John Peter Zenger in the 1730s. Now, in school, this is taught as the noble, shining birth of the freedom of the press.
It's always framed as a righteous crusade for objective journalism. But the reality is much messier. Zenger was a German immigrant printer in New York. He didn't start a newspaper out of a noble commitment to truth. He was essentially hired as a frontman by a faction of wealthy politicians who hated the newly appointed royal governor, William Cosby.
Governor Cosby was apparently incredibly corrupt and arrogant. So these wealthy opponents hire Zenger to print a paper, the New York Weekly Journal, whose sole purpose is to just roast the governor.
It was a total political hit job. They ran thinly veiled satirical ads comparing the governor to a monkey and his supporters to spaniels. Cosby was furious, and he had Zenger arrested for seditious libel.
And the mechanics of the law back then are fascinating because truth was not a defense.
Exactly. Under English common law at the time, it didn't matter if what you printed was 100% true. In fact, if it was true, it was considered more libelous because it was more likely to cause a breach of the peace or lower the estimation of the government.
Wow. So the only question for the jury was, did Zenger print the paper? And he obviously did.
But Zenger's lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, pulls off a brilliant piece of jury nullification. He argues to the colonial jury that they shouldn't punish a man for publishing the truth, regardless of what the British law says, and the jury acquits him.
So freedom of the press was born not from objective reporting, but from a deeply partisan roasting. But it established a crucial precedent. Colonial juries would not necessarily enforce British laws if they felt those laws were unjust.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the real catalyst of the revolution: British economic bungling following the French and Indian War.
The French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, was a massive global conflict between Britain and France. Britain won, securing control of North America. But fighting a global war is incredibly expensive. The British treasury was drained.
So Parliament looks across the ocean and says, hey, we just spent a fortune defending you colonists from the French. It's time you chipped in to pay off this debt.
Which logically, from London's perspective, made perfect sense. So they passed a series of taxes. First the Sugar Act, which clamped down on smuggling and taxed molasses, and then the infamous Stamp Act of 1765.
Break down the mechanics of the Stamp Act because it was uniquely infuriating to the colonists.
Right. Previous taxes were external taxes, tariffs paid by merchants at the port, factored into the price of goods. Most common people never saw the tax collector. But the Stamp Act was a direct internal tax. It required a physical royal stamp to be placed on almost every piece of printed paper used in the colonies.
Legal documents, newspapers, ships' papers, even playing cards.
Exactly. And it had to be paid in hard British currency, not colonial paper money. And crucially, who uses the most paper? Lawyers, merchants, and newspaper publishers.
The loudest voices.
Yes. Parliament managed to instantly infuriate the three loudest, most influential, and most litigious groups of people in America.
And the timing was terrible. The text points out that the end of the war brought a severe economic depression, the British military contracts dried up, people were broke.
So not only are they being taxed directly without representation in Parliament, but they're being squeezed when they have the least amount of money.
This brings us to a crucial debate among historians that the text outlines beautifully. Was the American Revolution a noble ideological fight for human rights and liberty, as the traditionalists claim? Or was it, as more progressive or radical historians argue, simply a transfer of power?
A transfer of power. Meaning, was this really about the lofty ideals of John Locke? Or was it just local, wealthy colonial elites looking at the British mercantilist system and saying, why are we giving a cut to London? We should keep all the wealth of this massive continent for ourselves.
The text points to figures like John Hancock as a prime example of this duality. Hancock was one of the wealthiest men in New England. How did he make his fortune? He was a massive smuggler.
Right.
He imported Dutch tea and French wine, completely bypassing the British customs officials to avoid paying taxes.
So when the British finally try to crack down on smuggling with the Sugar Act and the Townshend Acts, Hancock isn't just philosophically opposed. His bottom line is directly threatened.
The author suggests the truth of the revolution is a messy mingling of both perspectives. The elites needed the philosophical arguments of liberty to motivate the common people to fight, but the engine driving the conflict was economic control.
And you see this mastery of manipulation in the Boston Massacre. The text trips away the tummy tuck here, too.
The Boston Massacre in 1770 is traditionally portrayed as bloodthirsty British soldiers gunning down innocent, peaceful colonists. The reality is much more chaotic. Boston was an occupied city, heavily militarized. Tensions were incredibly high.
So what actually happened?
A crowd of angry colonists surrounded a small group of British sentries. The crowd was throwing snowballs packed with rocks, chunks of ice, and oyster shells. They were taunting the soldiers, daring them to fire.
In the confusion, a soldier is knocked down, a musket discharges, and a chaotic volley follows. 5 colonists are killed. It's a tragedy, a chaotic street brawl.
But the radical leaders, particularly Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, immediately weaponized the event for public relations. Revere produced a famous engraving that showed British troops standing in a neat line, firing a synchronized volley into a crowd of well-dressed, helpless citizens under the command of a bloodthirsty officer.
It was pure propaganda, and it worked brilliantly to inflame the other colonies.
This tension between noble, soaring ideals and raw, pragmatic, often ruthless power is perfectly encapsulated in the men who eventually wrote the nation's founding documents. We have to talk about the deep, agonizing contradictions of the founders.
Because you cannot understand American history without holding 2 opposing thoughts in your head at the exact same time. The most glaring, painful contradiction, of course, revolves around Thomas Jefferson and the institution of slavery.
Jefferson is the great American paradox. He is the author of the Declaration of Independence. He writes the most famous sentence in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights.
And while his pen was scratching those words onto parchment, he legally owned hundreds of human beings who were toiling in the fields of Monticello.
The text dives directly into the hypocrisy. During the Revolution, the British author Samuel Johnson stood up in Parliament and asked the ultimate devastating question. How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?
It is a devastating critique. And the text doesn't shy away from the most personal aspect of this contradiction, the Sally Hemings controversy.
Right.
For nearly 2 centuries, historians dismissed the rumors that Jefferson fathered children with his enslaved servant, Sally Hemings, as political slander.
But the text notes the definitive shift in that narrative. In 1998, DNA testing on the descendants of both Jefferson and Hemings proved conclusively that a male in the Jefferson line, almost certainly Thomas Jefferson himself, was the father of Hemings' children.
It forces us to confront the reality of power dynamics. Hemings was legally property. She could not consent. It makes the author of Our Liberty an active participant in the deepest moral failing of the nation.
And the text points out that Jefferson agonized over slavery intellectually. He knew it was an abomination. He wrote that he trembled for his country when he reflected that God is just.
But he didn't free his slaves.
No, his entire life, his fortune, his fine wines, his books, his leisure time to think and write about liberty were entirely subsidized by forced labor. He could not bring himself to sacrifice his standard of living to line with his moral philosophy.
And it wasn't just slavery where the founders present complex realities that challenge our modern narratives. Their views on religion were also far more nuanced than modern politicians often portray.
This is a major point in the text. There is a persistent modern debate about whether America was founded as a Christian nation. But the text explicitly points out that the word God does not appear anywhere in the U.S. Constitution.
Which was incredibly deliberate, because many of the key founders, Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, Madison, were deeply influenced by the European Enlightenment and a philosophy called deism.
Let's unpack the mechanics of deism because it's very different from traditional Orthodox Christianity. Deism is also called the clockmaker theory of the universe.
A clockmaker.
Yes, deists believed that a supreme being created the universe, established the laws of nature and physics like winding up a massive, intricate clock, and then stepped back.
Meaning God doesn't intervene in daily human affairs.
Correct. No miracles, no parting of the Red Sea, no answering prayers to help your football team win. The text quotes Benjamin Franklin, who viewed God as supremely perfect, but Franklin believed that this infinite creator had absolutely no need or desire to be worshipped by tiny, insignificant humans.
They viewed Jesus as a great moral philosopher, not necessarily as a divine supernatural being. I mean, Jefferson literally took a razor blade to a Bible and cut out all the miracles, leaving only the moral teachings of Jesus.
So when they built the government, they intentionally built a secular architecture. They explicitly banned religious tests for public office. The text even jumps ahead to a fascinating anecdote about President Teddy Roosevelt to illustrate how concepts of civil religion have shifted.
Oh, this is great. In the early 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt actually tried to remove the phrase, "In God We Trust," from American currency.
And modern audiences might assume he did this because he was a secularist or an atheist, but it was the exact opposite. Roosevelt was a devout Christian.
Right.
He believed that stamping the name of God on coins, which are used to buy liquor, visit brothels, or bribe politicians, was deeply sacrilegious. He thought it cheapened the divine.
It's so counterintuitive to how we argue about these things today. It proves that you can't just project modern political talking points onto historical figures.
And speaking of figures who resist simple categorization, the text brings up the bizarre case of Benedict Arnold.
The ultimate traitor. His name is literally synonymous with treason.
Yes, but the text forces us to look at the whole picture. Before his treason, Arnold was arguably the most brilliant and bravest battlefield commander the Americans had. At the crucial Battle of Saratoga in 1777, Arnold defied orders, rode onto the battlefield, and personally led a charge that shattered the British lines.
And that secured a massive victory that convinced the French to join the war on the American side.
But during that charge, his horse was shot and fell on him, severely shattering his leg.
So how does history handle a man who saved the revolution before trying to destroy it? The text mentions a bizarre monument at the Saratoga battlefield in New York. It is just a statue of a boot.
A boot?
Yeah. It honors the most brilliant soldier of the Continental Army who was wounded there, but it refuses to name him. It only honors his left leg.
Because the mechanics of his later treason were so devastating. He tried to sell the plans to the fort at West Point to the British. If the British took West Point, they would control the Hudson River, effectively cutting the colonies in half and probably winning the war.
So how do we evaluate these figures? How do we deal with Jefferson's slavery or Arnold's treason? The author's approach is that we must hold the opposing truths.
Right. To ignore their flaws is to write pure propaganda, but to dismiss their incredible achievements because of those flaws is to lose the lessons of history entirely. They were profoundly flawed humans who accomplished world-changing things.
But the inability of the founders to resolve these massive contradictions, especially the institution of slavery, guaranteed that this new nation was going to face immense, violent growing pains. They basically kicked a massive powder keg down the road for their children to deal with.
Which leads us right into the 19th century. The new nation rapidly expanded, often at a terrible human cost, setting the stage for an inevitable domestic fracture.
Right after the Revolution, things were not immediately peaceful and prosperous. There was massive economic chaos.
The first government of the United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation, and it was mechanically designed to be weak because the founders were terrified of creating another tyrannical central power like the king.
But it was too weak.
Far too weak. It had no power to tax, meaning it couldn't pay off the massive war debts. It couldn't regulate commerce between the states. Different states were printing their own worthless paper money, and this economic disaster hit poor rural farmers the hardest.
They were just getting squeezed.
Yeah, they were being dragged into debtors' courts and having their farms foreclosed on because they couldn't pay their taxes in hard gold or silver, which they didn't have.
This boils over into Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786. Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Revolution who hadn't been paid for his service, leads an armed uprising of desperate farmers to literally shut down the courts so they couldn't foreclose on any more farms.
And this terrified the elite class. George Washington, who was in retirement, was horrified. The rebellion proved that a weak central government couldn't maintain basic order. The mechanics of the Articles had failed.
So they had to pivot.
Exactly. This fear of anarchy is the direct catalyst that forced the leaders to meet in Philadelphia in 1787 to scrap the Articles and draft the U.S. Constitution, creating a much stronger federal government with a standing army and the power to tax.
And once that stronger federal government was in place, the country caught expansion fever. In 1845, a journalist named John L. O'Sullivan coined a phrase that defined the century: manifest destiny.
It is one of the most powerful and destructive ideological concepts in American history. Manifest destiny was the belief that Providence, or God, had explicitly allotted the entire North American continent for the expansion of the United States.
It framed expansion not just as a political goal, but as a divine mandate. We have to take the West because God wants us to spread our superior democratic institutions.
But the deeply uncomfortable reality, the tummy tuck that must be removed, is that this divine mandate required the violent removal of the hundreds of thousands of indigenous people who were already living there.
Which brings us to the policies of Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears.
By the 1830s, the cotton economy in the South was exploding. White settlers demanded access to the fertile lands in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, which were legally held by the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole.
And many of these tribes had assimilated, right?
Yes. They'd written constitutions, they farmed, some even owned slaves.
The Supreme Court, under John Marshall, actually ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that the states had no right to impose laws on native sovereign territory. The court sided with the Native Americans.
But the mechanics of constitutional power require the executive branch to enforce the court's rulings. President Andrew Jackson supposedly replied, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Jackson simply ignored the Supreme Court and pushed through the Indian Removal Act.
The logistics of this removal are horrifying. It was a forced march of tens of thousands of people under military guard thousands of miles west to Indian Territory in modern-day Oklahoma.
The text shares a deeply affecting primary source to illustrate the reality of this. Alexis de Tocqueville, a famous French political thinker, happened to be in Memphis in the dead of winter and watched the Choctaw tribe being forced across the ice-choked Mississippi River.
De Tocqueville wrote this haunting observation. He said, "In the whole scene, there was an air of ruin and destruction. They have no longer a country, and soon will not be a people." He recognized in real time that he was witnessing the systemic destruction of a civilization.
And what makes this era an agonizing historical paradox is that this brutal ethnic cleansing occurred simultaneously with the rise of what we call Jacksonian democracy.
Right. Jackson is celebrated as the champion of the common man. He expanded voting rights dramatically, eliminating property requirements so that all white men, regardless of wealth, could vote and participate in politics.
It is the ultimate American contradiction. It's as if democracy was a highly exclusive VIP club. The bouncers were aggressively expanding the building, knocking down walls to add new rooms for the common man to enjoy the party.
while simultaneously and violently kicking out the original owners of the land into the freezing cold to make room for the dance floor.
That tension is unbearable. And that rapid, aggressive expansion westward immediately raised the ultimate explosive question. As these new territories were carved into states and added to this VIP club, would they be slave states or free states?
Because maintaining the balance of power in the Senate between the North and the South was the only thing keeping the country together.
The club was about to tear itself apart. Apocalypse, then. The Civil War was the inevitable explosion of all those contradictions that had been baked into the Constitution from the very start.
By the mid-19th century, the United States was not one country. It was two distinct, fundamentally incompatible nations sharing a border. You had the North, which was rapidly industrializing,
We were building massive networks of railroads, factories, and telegraphs.
and its population was exploding due to wage labor capitalism and a massive influx of European immigrants.
And you had the South, a deeply proud, fiercely independent agrarian oligarchy. Its entire economic engine, social structure, and cultural identity were entirely, inextricably reliant on the forced labor of millions of enslaved Black people to produce cash crops, primarily cotton, for the global market.
The buildup to the Civil War wasn't a sudden break. It was a series of violent pressure releases. Every time a new territory opened up, the crisis flared. Look at Bloody Kansas in the 1850s.
Unpack the mechanics of Bloody Kansas, because it's essentially a proxy war before the actual war.
The federal government passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which relied on the concept of popular sovereignty. It essentially said, we won't decide if Kansas is slave or free. We'll let the people who move there vote on it.
Which is a terrible idea if the stakes are absolute power.
Exactly. So pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri flooded across the border to illegally vote and intimidate settlers, while anti-slavery abolitionists from New England ship in rifles, ominously called Beecher's Bibles, in crates marked as books.
And they literally fought a gruesome guerrilla war for years.
And then the Supreme Court throws gasoline on the fire with the Dred Scott decision in 1857.
Dred Scott was an enslaved man whose enslaver had taken him into free territory for several years. Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that living on free soil legally made him free. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court.
And Chief Justice Roger Taney writes one of the most disastrous opinions in legal history.
Taney didn't just rule against Scott, he went much further. He ruled that Black people, whether enslaved or free, could not legally be citizens of the United States. He wrote that they had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect.
Awful.
Furthermore, Taney ruled that Congress had no constitutional authority to ban slavery in any federal territory.
Which effectively meant the federal government couldn't stop the spread of slavery anywhere. The North was terrified that slavery was going to become a nationalized institution.
And this legal despair leads directly to the radicalization of men like John Brown.
John Brown is one of the most polarizing figures in the text. In 1859, Brown, a fierce fundamentalist abolitionist, leads a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia.
His goal was to seize the weapons, arm the local enslaved population, and spark a massive, violent slave revolt throughout the South. The raid was a tactical failure. Brown was captured by U.S. Marines, commanded by Robert E. Lee, tried for treason, and hanged.
But the reaction to John Brown perfectly illustrates the complete fracture of the nation.
Yes. In the North, many abolitionists viewed him as a righteous martyr. The philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson famously said that Brown's execution would make the gallows as glorious as the cross.
But the South viewed Brown as a pure existential terrorist. To them, he was a madman coming to murder their families in their beds.
And when Abraham Lincoln, a man who opposed the expansion of slavery, won the presidency in 1860 without a single Southern electoral vote, the South realized they had lost control of the federal government.
And they seceded, sparking the bloodiest conflict in American history. The text is full of vivid details about the mechanics of the war itself.
Like the Battle of Mobile Bay in 1864. This is where we get a famous quote, but understanding the mechanics makes it so much better. Admiral David Farragut is leading a Union naval fleet into the heavily defended harbor.
The Confederates had placed underwater naval mines, which they called torpedoes back then, all across the entrance.
One of the Union ships hits a mine and violently sinks, taking almost the entire crew down with it. The rest of the fleet stalks, terrified of the minefield. Farragut, who has literally lashed himself to the rigging of his flagship so he can see over the smoke, realizes that stopping under the heavy fire from the forts on shore is suicide.
So he shouts, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," and sails his ship straight through the minefield, betting that most of the mines were waterlogged and wouldn't detonate. And he wins the battle.
But the text is also careful not to give the North a tummy tuck. It is a myth that the entire North was a unified, progressive utopia fighting purely to end slavery. Racism was deeply systemic in the North as well, and the war was highly unpopular among the working class.
Look at the New York draft riots of 1863.
The mechanics of the first Federal Conscription Act were deeply skewed toward the wealthy. If you were drafted, the law allowed you to pay a $300 commutation fee, an enormous sum for a laborer, to buy your way out of service or hire a substitute to fight in your place.
So the wealthy politicians starting the war didn't have to fight it.
Exactly. This infuriated the working class, largely Irish immigrants in New York, who realized they were being forced into a meat grinder. They protested that it was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight.
But the protests quickly devolved into horrific racial violence. The mobs blamed Black Americans for the war. They burned down a Black orphanage and lynched innocent Black men in the streets of New York City. The Union Army actually had to march troops fresh from the battlefield of Gettysburg into Manhattan to put down the riots.
It underscores the deep, complex tragedy of the era. Now, I want to address something you asked about earlier regarding the Confederate Constitution. There is a persistent modern narrative that the South fought solely for abstract states' rights, not slavery.
Yes, if the South claimed they were fighting for the right of a state to govern itself, how did their actual founding document handle the ultimate right of humans to own themselves?
If you read the Confederate Constitution, which was modeled almost exactly on the U.S. Constitution, it explicitly and repeatedly protects the institution of slavery. It forbade any law that would deny or impair the right of property in Negro slaves.
So a Confederate state literally did not have the state's right to abolish slavery within its own borders.
Exactly. The Confederate Vice President, Alexander Stephens, gave a famous speech where he explicitly stated that the new government was founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition.
Wow.
The states' rights argument was fundamentally and explicitly about the right to maintain a slave-based economy.
After 4 years of unspeakable carnage and roughly 750,000 dead, the war ends. And the aftermath brings the creation of two profound cultural traditions that the text highlights.
We see the birth of Juneteenth, which celebrates June 19th, 1865, the day Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, and finally announced to the enslaved people there that the war was over and they were free months after Lee had surrendered, and 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation.
And we also see the creation of Decoration Day, which eventually became Memorial Day, started by grieving communities decorating the endless rows of graves of the fallen soldiers.
But the hopeful era of Reconstruction, the attempt to integrate freed slaves into the political and economic life of the South, was quickly met with horrific, organized backlash.
The text details the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And it's important to understand the mechanics of the Klan. They weren't just a disorganized hate group.
No, the text quotes historian Lerone Bennett, who brilliantly describes the Klan as a calculated paramilitary political operation. Former Confederate leaders and soldiers formed the Klan to serve as the terrorist wing of the Southern Democratic Party.
Their goal wasn't just violence for violence's sake. Their mechanical goal was political control. They used targeted assassination, arson, and psychological terror to intimidate Black men away from the ballot boxes and to murder white Republican politicians who supported Reconstruction.
Bennett's quote in the text says, "This control was achieved by the political use of terror, by fear." And, tragically, it worked. The North eventually grew tired of the endless occupation, pulled the federal troops out in 1877, and abandoned Black Southerners to decades of Jim Crow segregation and disenfranchisement.
The North turned its attention away from civil rights and fully toward the West and the economy. The end of the Civil War essentially allowed the industrial North to consolidate power. The federal government subsidized massive transcontinental railroads, and America ushered in an era where monopoly wasn't just a board game.
We enter the late 19th century, known as the Gilded Age. Mark Twain coined that term. Gilded means covered in a thin layer of gold to hide a cheap, decaying core. This era was defined by an intense, often violent struggle between massive, unchecked corporate wealth and the desperate working class.
We are talking about the era of the robber barons, men like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Andrew Carnegie. And the text includes a staggering quote from Carnegie that perfectly captures the psychology of this new elite class.
Carnegie believed in a concept akin to social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest applied to economics. To justify his immense, unfathomable wealth while his steel workers toiled 12 hours a day in dangerous conditions for pennies, Carnegie said that civilization itself started when the capable, hard-working man told the lazy one, "If thou dost not sow, thou shalt not reap."
He essentially claimed that the sacredness of property and the rights of millionaires to accumulate endless wealth were the fundamental pillars of human progress.
It was an era of completely unregulated cutthroat capitalism. They used vertical integration, buying up the mines, the railroads, and the factories to destroy competition and form massive trusts.
And the politicians were entirely in their pockets. The political corruption was staggering, and they didn't even try to hide it. The text mentions William Boss Tweed, who ran the Tammany Hall political machine in New York City.
The mechanics of a political machine relied on patronage. They would greet new immigrants right off the boat, get them a job, find them an apartment, and in exchange, the immigrant owed the machine their vote.
And once the machine controlled the politicians, they controlled the treasury. The text quotes a Tammany Hall politician named George Washington Plunkett, who famously and publicly defended what he called honest graft.
Plunkett distinguished between dishonest graft, like blackmailing a saloon keeper or stealing from the public till, and honest graft. He said, "I seen my opportunities and I took them."
Break down the mechanics of honest graft because it is hilarious and infuriating.
Plunkett explained that if he, as a politician, got tipped off that the city board was about to lay out a new park in a certain neighborhood, he would quietly go buy up all the land in that area before the news broke. Then, when the city officially announced the park, he would sell the land to the city at a massive inflated profit.
It is the exact mechanical definition of modern insider trading. He was using non-public government information for personal enrichment. It's fascinating that the excuses for political corruption haven't changed in 130 years. They just wore top hats back then.
While the politicians and the barons thrived, the labor forces were pushed to the absolute breaking point. The book details the Haymarket Square bombing in Chicago in 1886.
The mechanics of the labor movement at this time were desperate. Workers were striking simply for an 8-hour workday.
During a rally at Haymarket Square protesting police brutality against striking workers, an unknown person threw a dynamite bomb into the ranks of the police, killing 7 officers. The police panicked and opened fire into the crowd.
And the backlash against labor was swift and ruthless. The government arrested 8 anarchist labor leaders. Even though they had no evidence linking them to the actual bomb thrower, they were tried for their anti-capitalist beliefs. Several were hanged. It was a massive setback for the labor movement.
And during this exact same period of industrial boom and labor strife in the cities, the final tragic blows were being dealt to the Native Americans in the West.
The text ends the 19th century chapter with a massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890 in South Dakota.
The Sioux people, confined to reservations and starving, had adopted a spiritual movement called the Ghost Dance, believing it would restore their lands and resurrect their ancestors. The U.S. Indian agents panicked, misinterpreting the religious dancing as an impending military uprising. The army was called in to disarm a band of Minneconjou Lakota.
In the tense process of disarming them, a shot rang out, and the U.S. troops opened fire with Hotchkiss guns, which were essentially early machine guns that fired explosive shells. They massacred hundreds of men, women, and children who were fleeing into a freezing blizzard.
The text quotes Black Elk, an Oglala Lakota holy man who survived the massacre. Reflecting on it years later, he said, "I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. The nation's hoop is broken and scattered."
It is a devastating encapsulation of the ultimate cost of manifest destiny and empire building. And this deep tension between the immense wealth of the rich, the desperate struggles of the workers, the marginalized minorities, and the immense power of the government continued right into the 20th century. A century that brought global world wars, massive economic booms, and devastating busts.
The text does a brilliant job of synthesizing the 20th century by continuing to focus on these mechanics of struggle, highlighting the hidden domestic atrocities that textbooks often gloss over in favor of a victorious narrative.
For example, the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921. Textbooks often portray the 1920s as just flappers in the Jazz Age. But the text details how a thriving, affluent black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street, was utterly destroyed.
The mechanics of this are rooted in deep economic resentment and systemic racism. The Greenwood District was prosperous. Black citizens owned businesses, theaters, and airplanes. A minor incident in an elevator between a young black man and a white female elevator operator served as the spark.
A white mob, deputized and armed by local authorities, invaded the district. They looted homes, murdered residents, and literally used private airplanes to drop incendiary firebombs on American citizens.
Yeah.
They burned 35 square blocks to the ground, Americans attacking Americans, and it was entirely swept under the rug for decades.
The author also uses the 1920s to point out massive failures in social engineering, most notably Prohibition. The 18th Amendment banned the sale and manufacture of alcohol,
Which was an attempt to legislate morality. But the mechanics of Prohibition were a colossal political disaster. You can pass a law, but if millions of people still want a beer, you've just created a massive black market.
Exactly. Prohibition didn't stop drinking. It simply handed the entire liquor industry over to organized crime syndicates like Al Capone's. It corrupted local police forces and politicians who were bribed to look the other way, and it cost the federal government billions in lost tax revenue. It was eventually repealed because the mechanics of enforcement were impossible.
But the 20th century also saw massive, hard-fought victories for inclusion. The text notes that women waited 130 years after the signing of the Constitution for the 19th Amendment to finally grant them the right to vote in 1920.
And it wasn't granted willingly. It required decades of relentless grassroots organizing, protests, hunger strikes, and lobbying.
Then the century pivots into unprecedented global conflict, World War II, and the dawn of the atomic age. The text gives us a fascinating look into the psychology of President Harry Truman when he successfully tested the atomic bomb.
Truman wrote in his diary after the Trinity test, recognizing the world-ending magnitude of fission mechanics. He wrote that it might be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era, after Noah and his fabulous ark. He knew he was holding the power of total human annihilation.
And that profound apocalyptic fear dictated everything that followed in the Cold War. The text discusses the mechanics of how America dealt with the Soviet Union, not through direct warfare, which would mean nuclear winter, but through the policy of containment and the Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan was a brilliant piece of economic defense. The U.S. realized that desperate, starving, war-torn countries in Western Europe were ripe for communist revolution. So the U.S. pumped billions of dollars into rebuilding their economies. If people have jobs and food, they don't revolt. It was containing communism through economic stability.
But while America was projecting itself as the beacon of freedom and democracy abroad during the Cold War, domestically, it was forced to confront its own deep hypocrisy, the explosion of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s.
And again, the text focuses on the mechanics of change. It wasn't just politicians suddenly deciding to be moral. It was grassroots resistance forcing the issue. Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus sparked a meticulously organized, year-long economic boycott of the Montgomery transit system.
And the legal mechanics were brilliant. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP spent decades carefully chipping away at the legal doctrine of separate but equal, culminating in the Supreme Court's landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954.
They used sociological data, like the famous doll experiments, to prove to the court that segregating black children inherently caused deep psychological harm and instilled a sense of inferiority, violating the Equal Protection Clause. The author quotes historian Richard Kluger, who wrote that the court restored to the American people a measure of humanity. They recognized that when you stepped on a black man, he hurt.
But securing a legal victory on paper is very different from enforcing it in reality. The text describes the harrowing logistics of integrating Little Rock Central High School in 1957. Reporter Relman Morin watched the white mob surge forward like a wave, screaming and breaking windows when they realized the 9 black students had entered the school.
The mechanics of federalism were tested to the limit. President Eisenhower had to federalize the National Guard and send in the 101st Airborne Division combat paratroopers to escort American children into a high school.
The modern political landscape the book covers brings us right up to the edge of the present day. It walks through the mechanics of the Pentagon Papers, where Daniel Ellsberg photocopied top-secret documents exposing that the government has systematically lied to the public about the Vietnam War for decades.
It covers the mechanics of the Watergate scandal. It wasn't just a burglary. It was a president, Richard Nixon, utilizing the CIA and FBI to cover up a crime and destroy his political enemies, leading to his resignation.
And then the author does something really bold. He includes the 2000 election, the chaotic recount of Bush v. Gore, focusing on the mechanics of the Supreme Court, stepping in to stop the Florida recount using the Equal Protection Clause. And he covers the intelligence silos and failures leading up to the 9/11 attacks.
Which brings up a really important debate in historical circles. Is it too soon to analyze events from just a few years ago? When does current events become history?
Right. How can a historian effectively analyze 9/11 when the dust has barely settled and documents are still classified?
The text addresses this tension perfectly. Davis argues that history is fundamentally a tool to explain how we arrived at the present moment. Even if we lack the absolute clarity of 100 years of distance, we can apply historical patterns. For example, we can understand the intelligence failures before 9/11 by looking at the history of bureaucratic turf wars between the FBI and CIA. We can understand the Middle East by remembering the borders drawn at Versailles. History is the act of connecting the dots right up to today.
And to be absolutely clear, the text maintains strict neutrality. Davis isn't taking a partisan side. He's an equal opportunity critic. He reports the Supreme Court's intervention in 2000 and the intelligence gaps under multiple administrations before 9/11 as factual events that fit into this long, massive pendulum swing of the American story.
Absolutely. Think about the comprehensive journey we've just taken. We started with Norsemen chewing on wind-cured cod to survive the freezing Atlantic. We examined the catastrophic math error that drove Columbus across the ocean. We grappled with the agonizing cognitive dissonance of founders who wrote soaring treatises on human liberty while operating slave plantations.
We tracked the brutal mechanics of expansion and the Trail of Tears, the inevitable bloody explosion of the Civil War, the ruthless corporate consolidation of the robber barons, and the tumultuous, hard-fought social struggles of the 20th century. It all proves one definitive thing. American history is not a smooth, upwardly trending line of inevitable progress.
It is a pendulum. It swings between massive expansions of freedom and brutal crackdowns. It is a story of power struggles, deeply flawed heroes, incredible resilience, and devastating setbacks.
Which leaves you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. Throughout all of these complex historical mechanics, the text notes a recurring theme. History is not just made by presidents in Oval Offices or generals on battlefields. Social movements, whether it's abolition, the labor movement, civil rights, or women's suffrage, always start at the grassroots level.
The politicians are almost always dragged, reluctantly and kicking, behind the moral arc of the people. The power of one, the power of a single action by an ordinary citizen, a farmer in Massachusetts, a striking worker in Chicago, a woman on a bus in Montgomery, is the true mechanical engine of historical change.
So you shouldn't view history as a finished, dusty textbook that you just have to passively memorize. It is an ongoing living story, and you are currently writing the next chapter. History is simply the long-term consequences of our actions today.
Which means we are all historical actors right now.
So we're going to leave you with that. Next time you read the news or doom scroll through current events, don't just look for the easy binary answers. Remember that the historical X-ray machine is broken. The water is muddy. Refuse to accept the historical tummy tuck. Look for the messy, complex, profoundly human truths underneath, and try to connect the dots. Thank you for taking this massive deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the narrative. Keep looking for the why and the how, and we'll see you next time.